Hi, fifth graders, welcome back. Today we're reviewing Unit 4 content on slavery and Native Americans in the Americas. Our goal is to describe slavery in the American colonies. So first we're going to start talking about the colonists and the natives. We know that the 13 American colonies were founded by the British. And so these colonists from Europe are coming in, and early on they rely on the natives to help them with the fur trade and survival. Without the native support, the fur trade would not have been possible, and many colonies would have failed in their early years. So we know that the French who engaged in that fur trade relied on the natives to actually catch the animals and get the pelts for them. And we know that colonies like the Plymouth colony relied on the natives to teach them how to farm in this new world. So we also know that the natives were living in the land that the British colonized, and they were there for centuries, if not thousands of years, prior to the colonists' arrival. So the colonists arrive and they begin taking land and resources from the natives, even though the natives were there first. The colonists justify this to themselves, though. They argue that the natives had plenty of land, and there's so little land in Britain that the natives needed to give up some of that land to the colonists. The natives did not agree with this belief, but that's just how the colonists felt. Natives were also angry to have their land taken away from them. They felt that the colonists were also destroying forest habitats and polluting environments. So the two groups began fighting over land, both because the natives believe that the colonists have taken their stuff, and the places that are remaining, they're polluting them. So that's Native Americans. Now we're going to jump into the triangle trade. As Europeans began to send more and more colonies to the New World, a new trade pattern began to emerge out of the Columbian Exchange. And this trade pattern is called the triangle trade. It led to different continents being connected by trade, the growth of slavery in the Americas, and the destruction of powerful kingdoms in Africa. So in the triangle trade, we see that Europe would send manufactured goods to Africa. They also sent those manufactured goods to the colonies. They would then go to Africa, buy people to be enslaved, and send those to North and South America, where they would work on plantations, and those crops and raw materials would be sent back to Great Britain. And so again, we see those manufactured goods. So England had all the factories, but they didn't have a lot of farms. So in the factories, they would manufacture goods, send them to North America and to Africa. In Africa, they would buy enslaved people. Those enslaved people worked only in North and South America. They didn't really go to Europe too much. The Europeans didn't like to see the slavery that was producing all of the things that they were using in a day-to-day life. So instead, they went to the Americas where they worked. So in England, remember, it's small. It doesn't have a lot of farmland. North America has plenty of farmland because it's so large. So those raw materials are materials that come from the earth, and they're not quite finished and ready to be turned into usable things. They need to go to the factories in England. So here's how it worked. People in Africa were kidnapped or purchased, and they were shipped to the Americas to be slaves. The enslaved people would work on the plantations in America to produce raw materials like cotton and lumber. The raw materials were shipped to Europe, where they were turned into manufactured goods like cloth or furniture. These manufactured goods were traded to Africa and the Americas for enslaved people and raw materials. So we can see how each leg of this needs the other, and each one is causing the other to need more enslaved people, raw materials, or finished goods. So during this time, there's a rising demand for slavery. We know that the southern colonies had a hot, moist, rained a lot climate, and it had many rivers for water and trade. This leads to cash crop farming being very popular in the southern colonies. There were not enough white Europeans to farm the land, so they began importing slaves from Africa. We know that enslaved Africans were used because they had no option to ever stop working. They weren't paid anything, and they had familiarity with farming in similar climates. So Europeans in America began importing enslaved people. Over time, the 13 American colonies began to rely on slave labor in their economy. And we see here we have the New England, the middle, and the southern colonies. And we know that the farther south we go, the hotter it is. So these southern colonies are the hottest of all the colonies, and that's part of what makes them so good for farming. And we know that areas that have a lot of farming need a lot of labor, and the Europeans and American colonists here chose to import enslaved Africans to work on those farms. So the Middle Passage is the name of the leg of the triangle trade that transported Africans to the Americas. The ride was dangerous, and Africans were forced to live in terrible conditions. Many people died on the journey, and those who survived were forced into slavery once they arrived in America. Here we see some pictures of the Middle Passage. We can see that people were forced into very small spaces to go across there. This is a drawing of how people would be laid out during the day. You can see there's no room to even roll over or sit up. And here's another rendering of what it looked like at the time. So this was very inhumane and cruel. Many people died on the journey, and then when they arrived in the Americas, their lives were taken from them as they became enslaved people. In the British colonies, which we know were the 13 American colonies, slavery was most common in the southern colonies because it was warm, it was moist, and that made it suitable for farming cash crops on plantations. Access to rivers and ports also allowed cash crops to be sold around the world. So here, those southern colonies again, and many of the major cities are along these rivers and along the port. So they could farm those cash crops and then send them to Europe again so they can use their factories to turn them into manufactured goods. Most enslaved people were treated as property by their owners. They were forced to work outdoors in harsh conditions or inside as house servants. The children of enslaved people were forced to also live their lives as slaves. And we know that cotton farming was very popular in the South. This was a major cash crop. Cotton can be sent to Europe, and the factories can turn it into cloth for clothing. The abolitionist movement was a movement supported by some whites in the North and free people of color to end slavery in the colonies. Abolitionists felt that it was morally wrong, cruel, and inhumane to treat people the way they were in slavery. They wanted to end slavery in America. With the arrival of West Africans in America, their culture, such as food, religion, music, and dance, came to America as well. Enslaved people held on to their culture as a form of protest. And because they did that, a lot of those cultural elements remained alive in the colonies. And then today, many of those ideas and cultural elements are still alive today. And we see that in New Orleans with Mardi Gras Indians. Gumbo is a West African term and is similar to recipes cooked in West Africa. And even jazz and brass bands all have roots back to Africa. All right, fifth graders.